Steam Early Access can be a real blessing for indie developers. It allows them to sell their product while still developing it, giving them further funds to continue its development. Not to mention also receiving feedback from those who play it, which in return can make the game all the better. But sometimes early access can do more harm to a title than good, and the game we're looking at today is one title that shows many early access battle scars. Quest Hunter is an action RPG developed and published by 2 Zombie Games. It received a full release on March 8, 2019 after spending 2 years in early access, and is available on PC, Mac, Linux and Steam OS. While Quest Hunter is a decent action RPG, its design choices and pacing changes throughout, sometimes leading to slow and somewhat confusing gameplay. You take on the role of a treasure hunter. As he is happily flying around in his airship, the sky suddenly starts to turn dark and a storm begins to form, destroying his airship. Upon waking up, he finds his ship destroyed and begins making his way into the surrounding woodland. Eventually the hero finds out that the sun has been stolen and the daughter of the king has gone missing too, presumably kidnapped. And so your journey begins to find the sun and rescue the princess. The plot to Quest Hunter isn't all that original. What it boils down to is simply finding the bad guy, save the princess and return the sun to the sky. The story is separated into a total of 3 acts, each act working very differently in pace and telling of the plot. The first act works very well as an introduction, giving the player a goal which is to find the sun and save the princess. The second act doesn't really have any plot progression as such, instead tells the player where they need to go, and the whole act is a case of attempting to get to that side of the world. Then you have the third act, where everything just suddenly goes into 5th gear, where the entire rest of the plot flies along at breakneck speed. This sudden rapid pace makes it a bit overwhelming as new characters are always appearing and new twists and turns in the plot are revealed. It feels that the developer knew how to start it, but didn't know how to fit in the plot with the world and gameplay of the second act, resulting in them cramming it all into the third and shortest act of the game, giving a sense of rush. The plot works and the general ending and big reveal is well written and designed, but the second act of the game remains devoid of any form of plot progression, leaving those who want a story having to wait a long time before they get the next bit. But with that said, what keeps the game going is its general silly and humorous dialogue and characters. Throughout the game you meet plenty of zany and odd characters, each with their own unique personalities, which really help keep the game somewhat entertaining during those moments that lack the plot progression. But even with those characters, they're not enough to keep that grind and slow pacing at bay for the whole experience. One of the main features of the plot is that throughout your journey you will need to make dialogue decisions which can change how specific events play out. Some options grant new quests that would otherwise be unavailable, or could lead to rewards that you wouldn't have gotten with a different answer. Near the end of the first act you get a choice between stopping a gang of bandits or joining them. Your decision greatly affects certain events throughout the game, whereby joining them you will unlock a brand new quest line that would otherwise not be available, which is a great choice to have. The problem is, it is the only instance of such a big choice in the game. Never throughout the rest of the game are you given a choice like this that ultimately leads you on a different questline path. Another example of a plot idea being dropped is that throughout the game you get the option to get married. If your response is yes, the father of the girl you're to marry tells you it will take place upon the return of the sun. But come the end of the game, when the sun is back in the sky, nothing happens with this side plot. It is just forgotten. It's so disappointing as you come to expect there to be more, but there isn't. It is such a shame too, as having more of these would have really made up for the lack of plot progression during the second act, and it feels like a real missed opportunity where the player's decisions truly shape the world, not to mention making the entire game worth more than one playthrough. Overall, the plot is alright. It does its job and its characters really help keep the game entertaining. The lack of more player-made decisions, and those that are there become forgotten, mixed with the slow build-up of the first act followed by the lack of plot progression in the second, and the hectic speed of the pacing in the third, gives the game a chaotic storytelling. Storytelling that, while entertaining at times and satisfying to some degree at the end, isn't that enjoyable to experience as a whole. There's a lot to talk about when it comes to the gameplay of Quest Hunter. You have the character development, combat, puzzles, the digging for secrets, random encounters on the world map and the randomly generated dungeons. So there is plenty to get through. Let's start with the character development. As you progress through the game completing quests, finding secrets and defeating enemies, you gain experience points. After collecting so many experience points, you level up, with each new level requiring more experience points to increase to the next to a maximum of 20. Upon leveling up, you are rewarded 3 stat points which can be distributed into any of the 4 stats as you see fit. Those 4 stats being health, attack, defense and block. For each point allocated to your health, it increases it by 5, while for attack, defense and block, each point increases each of these by 1. Increasing attack heightens the amount of damage your attacks do, while defense lowers the amount of damage enemies do to you, and block increases the amount of damage your shield can absorb. The stat system works reasonably well, even if it is at a very basic level, but it does allow for some customization as players get to choose what stats they want to focus on depending on their play style. An all-out DPS character will take more damage but also deal more, while a block focused character will act more like a tank, taking a more block and hit approach. Along with the stats, there's also a skill system. How the skill system works is that as you progress in leveling up, you unlock new skills. To learn these skills, you will need to obtain a specific number of diamonds and crystals. The number of diamonds and crystals you need increases the more you level up each skill, and the more powerful the skill is, each skill having a maximum level of 10. You find diamonds and different types of crystals from opening chests and defeating enemies throughout the game. The skills are a 360 single strike that damages all enemies in its reach, an increase of defense to lower damage received, a freezing spell that freezes any enemy in range for a short duration, leaving them vulnerable, a fireball that falls from the sky damaging any enemy within its radius, chain lightning that damages a single target and any others adjacent to it, a powerful single strike that deals a large amount of damage, a tornado that damages and pushes back anything that gets within its range, haste which greatly increases your movement speed, poison cloud damages any living enemies within its radius by the second. It doesn't affect undead enemies though. And finally is Ghost Defender, which summons floating skulls that attack enemies within range. The higher the level, the more skulls and damage the attacks do. The skills are each unique and useful in their own right, but due to the game only allowing you to have 3 skills equipped at any one time, results in old ones quickly being replaced by the new. This isn't so bad when it comes to playing in single player, but if playing in co-op, it will result in everybody pretty much using the same skills due to their power. It results in there being no uniqueness between the different players, which is disappointing. Along with that, some of the skills are woefully overpowered, both in single player and in co-op. Having 4 players casting the likes of Chain Lightning, Tornado, Poison Cloud or any mixture of them at the same time would pretty much destroy anything. The problem lays with most of the mid to high level skills being area of effect spells. The reason being is that the AI of the enemies is very basic, where they either fire ranged projectiles or charge at you, making the AoE skills far too easy to use in an effective manner. A more varied combination of skills would be much better a choice. A mixture of AoE ranged and higher melee skills. The Tornado, for example, could be changed to a melee attack that allows the player to spin around on the spot for a set number of seconds, damaging enemies that come close. It would be a more powerful variation of the first skill that, while not very original, would make for a more specialising playstyle. And the Poison Cloud could be something like a meteor shower, a more powerful version of the fireball for example. Having such skills would result in there needing to be some care when using them. Right now you can use a combination of Poison Cloud and Tornado at the same time and just stand in the one spot, allowing enemies to approach, annihilating them as soon as they get close. Even some of the toughest enemies in the game don't stand much of a chance against it. Some changes here and there would certainly help with this. It's obvious that Quest Hunter was never designed to be like other action RPGs such as Diablo, Van Helsing, Din's Curse or Titan Quest and the likes. Instead it is designed to be more basic, allowing accessibility to as many audiences as possible. So I would never expect it to have a skill system as deep as them. But for a game that is designed for co-op over single player, it needs a little more depth to its skills, so the players can specialise and have their own role within the party. Right now, everyone from the perspective of skills will just end up using the same high level skills in an overpowering manner. As a whole, the stats system is basic but perfectly functional, and gives just about enough freedom of customization to be enjoyable. The skill system, however, is a mixed bag. I love the idea of needing to collect crystals and diamonds to learn and upgrade the skills. It results in your skills being separate to that of leveling up, and when playing with other players, allows for them to help each other by trading the needed materials. It is a really refreshing take on a system that has largely remained unchanged for almost 2 decades. But while that may be the case, it is in need of some refinement, be it changing some of the skills to bring more variety, or giving them a major balancing overhaul if changing is not a possibility. Either way, an improvement is needed, as right now, despite its fresh take on the system and its accessibility, it isn't all that interesting from a character development standpoint. As for the combat itself, it too is quite basic. How it works is that as you approach an enemy, they'll become aware of you and begin making their way towards you. You attack using the left mouse button and can block enemy attacks by holding down the right mouse button. Your shield will only block the attacks in the direction it is facing, so unless you turn your character around before being struck, you won't block any attacks from behind. Your shield also blocks projectiles like throwing knives, spells and arrows. Your shield absorbs the amount of damage that is the number of your block stat. So for example, if your block stat is 30 and the monster does 35 damage per hit, upon blocking with the shield, it will absorb 30 of the damage, but you will still receive 5 damage to your health. Your block stat is increased by distributing stat points to it upon leveling up, by equipping more powerful shields or by upgrading your current shield. Having the ability to block enemies adds a simple yet effective level of tactics to the game, as you need to choose when to block and when to attack. And the fact that the amount of damage blocked by your shield is determined by both the stat and the shield you're using results in you always needing to keep on top of your block stat if you're able to battle tougher enemies, otherwise your shield won't block enough damage. Almost the same principle applies to your attack damage and armor defense too. The power of your attack and your defense is determined by your attack and defense stats, which too are increased by stat points and the equipment you're using. In Quest Hunter's case, that being your weapon and your helmet. Throughout the game you'll find a variety of different weapons, helmets and shields, each one generally being a bit more powerful than the last, granting a sense of progression and power. The problem with the equipment in the game is that while in the first act you get plenty of new more powerful equipment, in the second and third act there are only one or two in each, making most of your stat increases coming from upgrading your current equipment and putting stat points into them. The thing about action RPGs is that their gameplay is monotonous, because it is essentially the same thing over and over again. But what makes them exciting and addictive is the equipment and the sense of progression in the player's power. And because there is so few weapons, helmets and shields in the second or third act, you don't get that excitement that you do in the first, where plenty of new items are present. This, mixed with the general block and hit tactics, then results in the combat feeling quite monotonous during long play sessions, especially when the pacing of the plot drops to practically zero in the second act, making that long drag feel even longer. The variety of enemies also doesn't help with this either, with each act only having a handful of new enemies to combat. Like with many aspects of the game, the first act has the most, while the second and third act only adds in 2, maybe 3 new enemies, which isn't a lot considering an act can last up to 4 or 5 hours depending on how thorough you are. And this is only further made worse by the previously mentioned AI, where enemies either attack from a distance or charge towards you. The developer did try to make enemies a bit more interesting in the third act, with the moves that can double strike you and the slugs who divide into smaller versions of itself upon dying. But it just isn't enough to make the combat varied and exciting as you progress. Enemies really need to have some special attacks of their own, similar to that of the end boss, but not to such a powerful degree. It would really help liven up the combat of the game. Another issue with the combat is that because it is a game that is designed primarily for co-op play, enemy placement at times can be very unfair for solo play, especially in the third act. While these moments are perfectly possible to beat in single player, they really slow down the pace of the game. It also makes the final boss a real ass to beat, as you need to deal with both him and his minions. In co-op, 2 players could focus on him while the others keep the minions at bay. But when you're playing solo, you have to deal with them all on your own. It takes ages to beat him and just feels you are at a constant disadvantage. But these unfair moments only really begin to happen halfway through the second act and then throughout the entire third act. And while on the topic of unfair enemies, the new enemy types that surface in the third act are real damage sponges. Again, this wouldn't be a problem in co-op, but the likes of the wood goblins and the armoured skeletons have way too much health for solo play. It isn't a case that they're challenging, but when dealing with 3 or 4 armoured skeletons at the same time, which becomes a regular thing near the end, they become very drawn out battles when facing them on your own, slowing the pace of the game down greatly. It is more of a minor annoyance than a major one, but shows that Quest Hunter was always intended as a co-op experience and that the single player was really only added in because it was seen as a necessity. It is something I can't blame the developer for doing, as if they didn't the masses would have crucified the game for not having it. The single player really needs to have certain points toned down on the number of enemies and the health and defense of certain enemy types. Then there is the crafting and upgrading of items. As you progress through your journey, you will collect an assortment of different kinds of materials, such as cloth, linen, iron and silver, which are dropped by defeated enemies and from opening chests. These materials, along with specific crystals and diamonds, the ones used to level your skills, can then be brought to the blacksmith to craft new equipment or upgrade your current gear. Each item can be upgraded to a maximum of level 6, with each level requiring more materials. Along with upgrading equipment, you can also craft weapons and shields with the blacksmith too, using the same materials. But only the weapons from Act 1 can be crafted. Any weapons or shields from Act 2 or 3 must be found through opening chests and finding secrets. Along with the blacksmith, there is also the carpenter, who can upgrade the size of your inventory and stash chest. Alternatively, the basic materials such as cloth, linen, iron and silver can be purchased from the carpenter for a price. Like with many mechanics of Quest Hunter, the crafting is pretty basic. The upgrading of your equipment is a really nice touch that really comes into play come the second and third act, where there are only 1 or 2 new pieces of each type of equipment to be found. The issue with the whole crafting system is that the actual crafting is abandoned after the first act, as no new weapons become available to craft, which leaves me with the question of why have it there to begin with if it isn't going to be used for the rest of the game. It makes no real sense as to why the developer chose to have it for Act 1, then pretty much got rid of it for the rest of the game. It's such wasted potential, as the crafting even in its basic state was interesting and made all the collecting of the materials feel worth it. But after the first act it is no more, with only the upgrading of equipment left. And with the equipment only being possible to upgrade to level 6, you end up with a load of materials and nothing to really use them on with the exception of upgrading your stash and backpack. But even the upgrading of your stash and backpack has its own questionable design. For starters, the backpack can be upgraded 14 times, adding an additional 14 slots for items and equipment. The problem is there aren't that many items in the game, resulting in, unless you carry a lot of old equipment, which would be utterly pointless, your inventory will never be full, which then raises the question of why is there even a stash to begin with. It feels like the developer had plans for a crafting system and for a lot more items to be implemented into the game, but by the time Act 2 was brought into the game, the crafting, or at least the majority of it, was dropped. Maybe it was due to gameplay balancing, maybe it was from player feedback throughout the early access phases. It's hard to tell. Of what is there works well, but it is a system that gives false expectation, and I really wish that the developer would make a decision as to whether or not the game is going to have crafting. If they do, they should have it for all 3 acts, and if not, it shouldn't be in any of them. It's as simple as that. Throughout the game there is an assortment of puzzles that you need to complete in order to progress. Most of these puzzles are a case of simply moving either a block or a set of blocks to make a bridge, but there are other puzzles such as lever combinations and finding orbs or blocks and placing them in their holders or pressure pads. Most of the time the answers to these puzzles can be found throughout the same map, often found on a note laying on a table or the likes, so they aren't exactly taxing, keeping the flow of the game going while changing up the gameplay a bit from time to time. The one issue I would have with these puzzles is that, like many aspects of the Quest Hunter, they're designed with co-op in mind, resulting in solo players often having to journey back and forth with the orbs or blocks to complete a puzzle. It isn't a big deal, it just means that the puzzle sometimes takes a good bit longer for those who are playing solo, which can be a bit frustrating as player movement is greatly slowed when carrying objects. One of the main features of Quest Hunter is the ability to dig for treasure throughout most of the maps of the game. How this works is when you come into close proximity of a buried treasure chest, the shuffle button on the right side of the screen will glow in a wave pattern. All you need to do is click the shuffle button while it is glowing and you will dig up the hidden chest, allowing you to open it and obtain the rewards within. Some secrets and levels are found in trees and rocks too, meaning you need to chop down trees and bash the rocks throughout a level while looking for the secrets. In some cases the secrets can be items hidden behind objects like buildings or small mountains or the likes. The seeking out and finding of the secrets is great fun, as you always know how many secrets you have found and still remain hidden in a level by opening the to-do list on the right side menus. The issue with the secrets is that the further you progress in the game, the less rewarding finding these are, as the chests you dig up don't seem to scale with your progression in the game. This results in you often getting the same amount of diamonds and crystals in Act 3 as you would in Act 1. Though any crystals and diamonds are useful, I would have thought, especially with Act 3 and finding secrets being a bit trickier due to the environment, the rewards would have been better, but they aren't. Aside from the problem of them not being very rewarding later in the game, there is always that excitement about opening a buried chest, wondering what treasures are within, and if the developer could scale the chest rewards as you progress in the game, it would really bring the mechanic to the next level. As you progress through the game, revealing new locations on the map, randomly generated dungeons unlock that you can go to whenever you want. The idea of these dungeons is to allow the player or players to go in and find diamonds and crystals and gain experience to level up before progressing to the next part of the main plot. All the while, each time you enter, the layout of the dungeon is different from the last. They're a nice idea, allowing players to do a bit of leveling up if the next main quest is a little tougher than they like, but there are a number of issues with these dungeons. The first is that while the layout does change, the dungeons generally consist of nothing but various sized empty rooms containing enemies to defeat and rocks to bash. There are reward chests at the end, but aside from that there isn't really much to see or experience. The pool of assets the engine has to choose from for the dungeon layouts are too small, and all they offer are the same rooms just in a different order. Admittedly, each dungeon is slightly different environmentally, but there is no reason to even attempt them unless you really feel you have to, and after completing one or two, they just become boring. The second problem with the dungeons is that in the first act there are 4 of these dungeons, all of which are optional, while the second act has 2 which are mandatory to complete at least once in order to progress in the game, and then the third act has no such dungeons at all. Which once again raises the questions of why have the dungeons in the first act optional and then have 2 in the second act mandatory, and then why not have any at all in the third act, the one act that could have done with such dungeons more than the other 2. It feels like they ran out of ideas with the second act and made them mandatory to draw out the playtime of it to make it as long as the first, while having none in the third just adds to the sense of rushed development that the pacing of the plot already gives. It is that indecisiveness again where it ends up fiddling with players' expectations that they themselves give the player in the first act. You get the impression that the developer was torn between their own creative decisions and player feedback. Some players liked the dungeons, others hated them, and the developers just didn't know what to do, so they got rid of them altogether for the third act. At the end of the day, 2 zombie games need to make a decision. Keep the dungeons and place them in all acts and make them optional, or make them mandatory, or get rid of them all altogether. If I was to give my opinion, keep them but make them all optional and in all the acts. Having those two mandatory in Act 2 was bloody horrible, and slowed down the pace of an already very slow act even more. Overall, the dungeons are a neat idea, but the changing in their design throughout the game makes it feel like you're playing with a bored dungeon master who is changing the rules as they please, and the experience as a whole is worse for it. Much like with the original Fallout games, as you move from location to location on the world map, there is the possibility of random encounters. These random encounters are very small maps with a small number of enemies and secrets to be found, often with some sort of humorous dialogue at the start of them. The idea of having such encounters is pretty good. It allows the developer to add in a few more chuckles along the way without being restricted by plot dialogue. The problem is, there just isn't enough of them or any that stand out in a unique manner. In the first act, for instance, I believe there are only around 3, maybe 4 different encounters, before they begin repeating themselves, resulting in them losing their charm. On top of that, there is a misunderstanding of what made them enjoyable in Fallout 1 and 2 and why they worked so well in those games. You see, in the Fallout games there were special encounters that were rare but offered something special, be it a reference, a parody, or something cool in the game that couldn't be found anywhere else, like the Alien Blaster for example. Such special encounters added excitement to the whole idea of having them, where players wanted to find them for themselves. The problem with encounters in Quest Hunter is that there are so few variations of them, they quickly become boring and feel more of a slowdown than actually being there for fun. By no means do they ruin the experience, but there needs to be more of them, and to have some that grand items or something unique that you wouldn't find anywhere else in the game. This would really make them all the more enjoyable to play. As you progress through the game, you find torches which can be used to light up light sources throughout the many locations in the game. These torches act as a save system where upon lighting them, any loot that you obtained up until that point in the level will be saved. Therefore, if you die, you will only lose the loot that you collected after you lit the light source. They also act as a checkpoint where you will start at the last lit torch if you die or exit the game. Torches themselves are reasonably common, but you still need to use them sparingly, otherwise you will quickly run out. They are often found in chests and can also be bought from shops. I like the idea of lighting the torches as it allows you to save your game, and upon returning later on or the next day, you will start off exactly where you lit the last torch, meaning you don't have to run through the map from the very beginning again, which is great. The final feature to discuss is Clash on Graveyard. The Clash on Graveyard is an additional mode that becomes available to play from the main menu screen when you have a character that reaches level 5. This is essentially a survival mode with a total of 10 rounds where the player needs to survive as long as they can with only the equipment available in the graveyard. In order to progress to the next round or wave, you need to defeat all the enemies that come into the graveyard, with each wave getting progressively more difficult. At the end of each wave you will level up, allowing you to place stat points into the stats of your choice, along with unlocking a new chest with new equipment to further increase your stats and crystals to unlock and level up skills. The main objective of the mode is to complete wave 9, which unlocks the achievement. After that, wave 10 is just a continuous onslaught. Each time you kill an enemy, a new one arrives in to replace it, and you just have to hold out as long as you can, obtaining as many points as possible. It is a fun little addition to the game that puts everything you've learned from playing it by pitting you into an arena with limited skills and equipment. There is also a leaderboard for those who like a bit of competitiveness, but as with any leaderboard, there are those typical unbeatable and unrealistic scores in the millions. It is a mode that you'll only play once, maybe twice, as once you've unlocked the achievement for it, there isn't much reason to return to it. But nevertheless, it is still good fun while it lasts. To sum up, the gameplay of Quest Hunter is alright. While it has many problems and odd design choices at times, it does try new and fresh ideas that, while don't always work, still help to create an enjoyable enough experience with plenty of comedy throughout. But it is a game that I would recommend being played in co-op, be it online or on the couch with family or friends, over the single player. The single player has between 19 to 22 hours of gameplay for a thorough playthrough, and for achievement hunters you're looking at about 20 to 25 hours to get them all. Co-op play will probably take less time, I'd estimate maybe 15 to 17 hours or so, due to the gameplay being faster paced than that of single player. It is a game that was developed and designed with co-op in mind, and that is definitely where the game would be at its best in practically every way. As a single player experience, it tends to drag out a bit and at times can be quite frustrating. If you intend on getting Quest Hunter, I suggest saving it for a rainy weekend and gather the family or some friends around on the couch, and give the game a go, as you're bound to have some good fun and plenty of chuckles from it. The atmosphere to Quest Hunter is fantastic. Throughout the whole game you always feel like this small insignificant being who gets unwittingly dragged into the world filled with nothing but darkness, where they suddenly become the only one capable of solving everyone's problems. It has a very upbeat nature to it, where throughout the whole game the soundtrack has a form of heroic and adventurous tone to it in a very light-hearted and cartoony style. It makes you feel like this small little man that was never destined to be a hero, and yet here you are, slaying monsters and helping people with their problems and rescuing princesses. From the very moment you jump off the ground and scout the area for culprits responsible for destroying your ship, to challenging a group of bandits to the journey through the swamplands, every bit of Quest Hunter has that upbeat, heroic and grand adventure tone going through it, and it works brilliantly with the art style and lightheartedness and good fun nature of the game, and in many ways really carries the game throughout. Quest Hunter has been the most challenging game I've had to cover in a long time. Not just because there are so many things to talk about and assess, but because there are so many pros and cons about each of those features and mechanics. Quest Hunter is definitely one of those games that early access hasn't been kind to, and probably did more harm than actual good for the end product. It is a game that was undoubtedly intended on being much bigger and having a lot more content when it first started its journey in early access 2 years ago. The first act is evidence of that. But somewhere along the way something went very wrong, and a lot of the really promising features that were present in the first act were dropped in the others, along with certain design choices being very confusing and indecisive. Why did all this happen? Well, nobody but the developer can tell that. If I was to speculate, maybe player feedback made designing the game difficult. Maybe the budget began to run low and the game didn't do as well in early access as the developer had hoped, and compromise had to be made. It's hard to tell, as these are just two of the many challenges that indie developers face every day with every title they make. With all that said, however, Quest Hunter is a game that has been made with utmost passion, where every mechanic, feature, level and character is a labour of love. Despite the game's many problems, it still does enough right that it is an alright experience, especially if you were to play in co-op. There's plenty of content even if some features were dropped after the first act, and it is one of those few games that genuinely make you chuckle and has a positive nature about it that is really uplifting and refreshing in an industry that focuses on mature and dark themes in a cinematic manner. Quest Hunter is one of those games that aren't so full of problems that I could call it bad, and there is enough fun where it isn't boring most of the time. But I wouldn't call it a good game either. So after literally days of thinking this through, I've come to the conclusion that Quest Hunter is okay, and with that, I give it a 6 out of 10. Early access is easy to look as this promised land that can only be a good thing for a small indie developer. It allows the developer to earn extra funding through sales and gain important feedback from the player base. But what developers don't realise is that sometimes early access isn't as lucrative on sales or feedback as they think. Player feedback can be a fickle beast at the best of times, making the design of a game challenging, as you often get caught in split opinions or ever-changing feedback every time you implement a new feature or change something. And Quest Hunter has sadly been one of those games that got caught up in the chaos that is early access, and suffered for it in the long run.